On the morning of September 2, 1945, the Pacific War ended not with a battle, but with a ceremony. In Tokyo Bay, beneath a sky filled with the low thunder of engines, Japanese officials stood aboard the American battleship USS Missouri as General Douglas MacArthur prepared to accept Japan's unconditional surrender. What surrounded them that day was not merely a fleet, it was a statement. More than 300 Allied warships filled the bay. Battleships lay at anchor like steel islands. Aircraft carriers stretched so far across the water that their silhouettes merged with the horizon. Cruisers, destroyers, and submarines formed layered defensive rings around the flagship. Above it all, nearly 900 American aircraft passed overhead in precise formations, wave after wave, filling the sky with the unmistakable sound of total victory. For the Japanese representatives, this was not just defeat, it was confirmation, a physical manifestation of something they had been warned about years earlier and had chosen to ignore. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was dead for more than 2 years by that point. In April 1943, American fighters had intercepted his aircraft over the Solomon Islands after cracking Japanese naval codes, killing the one man in Japan who had truly understood what war with the United States would become. But as the surrender documents were laid out on the deck of the Missouri, everything Yamamoto had predicted stood in steel, fuel, and firepower. The tragedy was never that Japan lacked intelligence about American power. The tragedy was that Japan's leadership knew and went to war anyway. The warning began long before Pearl Harbor, long before Midway, long before Guadalcanal. It began with Yamamoto himself, a naval officer who understood America not through ideology, but through experience. From 1919 to 1921, Yamamoto lived in the United States as a student at Harvard University. He was not a tourist. He did not observe America from diplomatic receptions or military briefings. He rented a modest room near Boston, walked the streets, rode public transport, and immersed himself in daily American life. At the time, Yamamoto was 35 years old, already a veteran of war. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet. He understood violence. He understood naval warfare. But nothing in his combat experience prepared him for what he encountered in America. What struck him first was scale. America was not merely larger than Japan, it functioned differently. Yamamoto quickly realized that abundance was not a luxury, it was the foundation of American society. Goods were not hoarded, fuel was not rationed, food was not scarce. Entire systems were built around excess rather than conservation. He learned to play poker and bridge, games that became lifelong obsessions. Through them, he studied American psychology. He noticed patterns. Americans were aggressive, competitive, and willing to take calculated risks. They did not fear loss the way Japanese culture did. They learned from mistakes and adjusted quickly. These were not the traits of a fragile society. Yamamoto also focused on economics, especially the one resource that modern war depended on more than any other: oil. Navies ran on fuel. Aircraft consumed it at terrifying rates. Mechanized armies could not function without it. Yamamoto traveled to Texas, where oil fields stretched endlessly across the land. Wells pumped petroleum at volumes that Japan could barely comprehend. Refineries operated day and night. Tank farms held millions of barrels in reserve. Japan, by contrast, had almost no domestic oil production. Every gallon had to be imported across vulnerable sea lanes from Southeast Asia. Yamamoto immediately understood what this meant. A war with the United States was not just a contest of ships or planes, it was a contest of fuel, and Japan would lose it. He traveled to Detroit, where he observed automobile factories operating on assembly lines that never seemed to stop. He watched as parts were produced interchangeably, machines replacing labor, efficiency multiplied at scale. One American plant could outproduce Japan's entire automotive industry in a fraction of the time. In Pennsylvania, he witnessed steel mills pouring molten metal day and night. Rivers of steel flowed continuously, feeding factories that converted raw material into finished products with mechanical precision. Pittsburgh alone produced more steel than Japan's entire empire. These observations changed Yamamoto permanently. After returning to Japan, he rose steadily through the ranks of the Imperial Navy. He became a strong advocate of naval aviation, arguing that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would determine the future of warfare. He helped shape Japan's early carrier doctrine, contributing to the creation of the most advanced naval air force in the world at the time. From 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto returned to the United States as a naval attaché in Washington. His understanding deepened. He studied United States newspapers, followed political debates, and interacted with businessmen, officers, and engineers. He became fluent in English. He observed not just American industry, but American culture, its confidence, its optimism, its belief in problem solving. And throughout his career, he issued the same warning. In 1940, as Japan's military leadership pushed for confrontation with the Western powers, Yamamoto was asked directly what would happen if Japan went to war with the United States. His answer was precise and devastating. He said that if ordered to fight, he would run wild for 6 months to a year. Japan would win victory after victory. American forces would be stunned. The Pacific would fall quickly. But after that, he said, he had no expectation of success. Yamamoto explained that anyone who had seen Detroit's factories and Texas oil fields knew Japan could not win a prolonged war against America. This was not pessimism, it was mathematics. He went further. If Japan truly intended to defeat the United States, he said it would not be enough to seize Guam or the Philippines. It would not be enough to take Hawaii or even San Francisco. Japan would have to march into Washington, D.C. and sign a peace treaty in the White House. This was not bravado. It was a warning. Yamamoto was making one point unmistakably clear. Anything short of total conquest would fail, and total conquest of America was impossible. Despite this, Yamamoto remained loyal. When Japan chose war, he did not resign, he did not sabotage the effort. Instead, he applied his intellect to giving Japan its best possible chance by delivering a crippling opening blow. Pearl Harbor was designed to buy time. Time was the only resource Japan lacked, and as Yamamoto knew better than anyone, time was exactly what America needed. When the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched on the morning of December 7, 1941, it was not born of confidence. It was born of desperation. Admiral Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. The only conceivable path to success was to strike so hard, so suddenly, and so decisively that America would lose the will to fight before its industrial strength could be fully mobilized. Pearl Harbor was meant to be a psychological blow as much as a military one, a shock powerful enough to paralyze American resolve. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu in 2 massive waves. More than 350 planes, launched from 6 aircraft carriers, descended on the harbor. American sailors were eating breakfast. Soldiers were still asleep. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, lined up tightly to guard against sabotage rather than air attack. It was the worst possible posture. Battleships were hit in rapid succession. The USS Arizona was struck by a bomb that penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion ripped the ship apart, killing more than 1,100 men in seconds. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping hundreds inside. The USS West Virginia burned and sank at her moorings. In total, 18 American ships were sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. From a tactical standpoint, the attack was a stunning success. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers exhilarated. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave and transmitted the famous signal, Tora, 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 circled the harbor, watching American ships burn. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the strike force, congratulated his officers. They had achieved surprise. They had inflicted heavy losses. The Pacific Fleet appeared crippled. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. When news reached him aboard his flagship, the battleship Nagato, his reaction was subdued. He understood what others did not. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had escaped destruction. The fuel tank farms were untouched. The submarine base was intact. Most importantly, the attack had united the American public overnight. Yamamoto knew American psychology too well to mistake silence for weakness. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States had been deeply divided over entering the war. After Pearl Harbor, that division vanished. Congress declared war with only a single dissenting vote. Millions of Americans who had opposed intervention now demanded retribution. Still, Yamamoto's prediction appeared to be unfolding. The 6 months of victory began almost immediately. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with breathtaking speed. Wake Island fell in December. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Manila was declared an open city as Japanese troops advanced through the Philippines. In February 1942, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore collapsed, and over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marched into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. The Dutch East Indies fell soon after, delivering the oil resources Japan had desperately sought. Burma followed. Japanese troops advanced from the Aleutians in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, from India's doorstep to the central Pacific. Never in history had an empire expanded so far, so fast. Japanese newspapers proclaimed destiny fulfilled. Military leaders basked in triumph. The Western powers appeared broken. The rising sun flag flew over territories containing hundreds of millions of people. But Yamamoto counted days, not victories. He knew that across the Pacific, American factories were beginning to move. He knew that every Japanese success bought time, but also consumed it. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction reached its deadline. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese Navy and the United States Navy met near Midway Atoll. Yamamoto intended this battle to be decisive. He assembled the most powerful carrier force Japan had ever deployed, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, and over 250 aircraft. The plan was complex, perhaps fatally so. Japanese forces were divided into multiple task groups spread across hundreds of miles. Yamamoto commanded from the battleship Yamato, positioned far behind the carrier strike force. Communication was difficult, coordination fragile. The Americans, meanwhile, knew the attack was coming. Through cryptanalysis at Station Hypo in Hawaii, American codebreakers had identified Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese fleet. Yorktown should not have been there. Damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese intelligence believed her out of action for months, but American repair crews worked around the clock, patching her flight deck and restoring her systems in just 72 hours. It was a feat of industrial and human endurance, and a preview of what Yamamoto had warned about. The battle unfolded on the morning of June 4th. Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island at dawn. American torpedo bombers launched desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers and were slaughtered to the last man. But while Japanese fighters were pulled low, chasing torpedo planes, American dive bombers arrived overhead. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were transformed into burning wrecks. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were fatally hit while their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Fires spread uncontrollably. Explosions ripped through hangar decks. By afternoon, they were abandoned. Hiryu counterattacked and crippled Yorktown, but she too was found and destroyed later that day. By nightfall, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. The core of its carrier force, the weapon that had conquered the Pacific, was gone. Yamamoto was not surprised. Midway came exactly when he said it would. The 6 months were over. From that point forward, Japan would fight a war it could not win. After Midway, the nature of the Pacific War changed completely. From the first time, Japan was no longer advancing. From this point forward, it would fight defensively, reacting to American moves rather than dictating them. Admiral Yamamoto understood the implications immediately. The carriers lost at Midway were not just ships, they were irreplaceable instruments of power. Worse still, the pilots who had gone down with them represented years of elite training Japan could not duplicate. While Japanese shipyards struggled to assess their losses, American industry was only beginning to accelerate. Before the war, Japan had possessed 6 large fleet carriers. After Midway, only 2 remained operational. Construction on replacements began immediately, but Japan's industrial limitations were stark. Steel was scarce, skilled labor was limited. Fuel shortages worsened by the month. Each new carrier required years to complete, and even then, there were not enough trained pilots to fill their decks. The United States faced none of these constraints. When war began, America already had 7 fleet carriers. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new carrier almost every month. By 1944, the Pacific Fleet included more than 20 fleet and light carriers, with dozens more under construction. This was not merely replacement, it was exponential growth. The centerpiece of this expansion was the Essex-class aircraft carrier. These ships displaced over 27,000 tons, carried nearly 90 aircraft, and were faster, better armored, and more resilient than any Japanese carrier ever built. They incorporated lessons learned from early battles, improved damage control, armored flight decks, better radar, and more efficient aircraft handling systems. Before the war, building such a ship would have taken 3 to 4 years. American yards operating around the clock in 3 shifts reduced construction time to as little as 14 months. Prefabrication techniques allowed entire sections to be built simultaneously and welded together with unprecedented speed. While Japan counted ships, America counted production schedules. The same pattern emerged in every category of warfare. American destroyers were being launched at such speed that naval planners joked they were running out of crews to man them. Liberty ships, cargo vessels that formed the backbone of Allied logistics, were built faster than submarines could sink them. More than 2,700 Liberty ships were produced during the war. One, the SS Robert E. Perry, was assembled in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of American capacity. Japanese naval officers watched this with growing alarm. They had built their strategy around attrition, bleeding the enemy slowly, assuming losses would force negotiation. That logic had worked in earlier wars, but it depended on the enemy's inability to replace losses quickly. Against the United States, attrition worked in reverse. Every American ship sunk was replaced by 2 more. Nowhere was this imbalance more brutally exposed than on Guadalcanal. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Their objective was modest but crucial: seize an unfinished Japanese airfield that threatened Allied supply lines between the United States and Australia. Japanese construction crews had nearly completed the airfield when the Marines arrived. American engineers finished it in days, laying down pierced steel planking and bringing it into operation with astonishing speed. They renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Control of Henderson Field meant control of the skies. Japanese commanders immediately understood the threat. If the Americans held the airfield, Japanese ships could not safely reinforce the island during daylight. The battle for Guadalcanal became a desperate struggle to destroy Henderson Field or die trying. What followed was 6 months of some of the most brutal combat of the Pacific War. Japanese naval forces fought fiercely in nightly surface engagements, where their training and torpedo tactics gave them an advantage. Battles like Savo Island were disasters for the Allies. In one night, Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 sailors. But the difference lay not in bravery or skill, it lay in replacement. Every American ship lost was already being replaced in a shipyard thousands of miles away. Every Japanese ship lost represented a permanent reduction in strength. The Japanese resorted to the Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs down the slot to deliver troops and supplies under cover of darkness. But destroyers could carry only men and light equipment. Heavy artillery, vehicles, and sufficient food could not be delivered in meaningful quantities. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began to starve. Rations were cut repeatedly. Disease spread rapidly. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi weakened entire units. Soldiers ate grass, roots, insects, anything they could find. Some became too weak to carry their rifles. American troops, by contrast, were supplied continuously. Ammunition was abundant. Artillery support was relentless. Aircraft from Henderson Field attacked Japanese ships daily. Japanese attacks were courageous and futile. At Bloody Ridge, at the Maranhão River, and across the jungle approaches to Henderson Field, Japanese troops charged American positions and were cut down by machine guns and artillery. Entire formations were annihilated. By February 1943, Japan evacuated its surviving forces from Guadalcanal. Of the 36,000 Japanese troops committed, more than 20,000 were dead, most from starvation and disease rather than combat. American losses were severe but sustainable. Japan's losses were catastrophic. Guadalcanal revealed the truth Yamamoto warned about. Japan was fighting a war of manpower against a nation of machines, and the machines were only getting started. By 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting decisively, not just at sea, but in the air. Early in the war, Japanese air power had been terrifyingly effective. In 1941 and early 1942, Japanese pilots were among the best trained in the world. Their flight training was rigorous, selective, and uncompromising. Carrier pilots often accumulated over 700 flight hours before seeing combat. Their aircraft, especially the Mitsubishi A6M-0, were optimized for the vast distances and tight maneuvering of Pacific warfare. The Zero could outclimb and outturn almost any Allied fighter. In the opening months of the war, Japanese pilots dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Allied airmen learned quickly that engaging Japanese fighters in turning dogfights was usually fatal. But this early superiority concealed a fatal weakness. Japanese air doctrine emphasized elite quality over replaceable quantity. Pilots were trained for perfection, not mass production. Losses were expected to be minimal. The system worked until Japan encountered an enemy that could afford losses and replace them endlessly. Midway and Guadalcanal destroyed that illusion. At Midway, Japan lost hundreds of its best carrier pilots in a single day. Over Guadalcanal, more were lost in attritional combat they could not avoid. Each experienced pilot killed represented years of training that could not be replaced. American losses were heavy too, but American training pipelines absorbed them. The United States treated flight training as an industrial process. Flight schools operated across the country, turning civilians into aviators in structured stages. Primary trainers, advanced trainers, gunnery schools, and carrier qualification programs all operated simultaneously. By 1943, American pilots were entering combat with hundreds of flight hours and standardized tactical training. Japan could not keep pace. Fuel shortages limited flight training. Replacement pilots graduated with fewer hours, sometimes fewer than 200 total flight hours, compared to the veterans they replaced. Some carrier pilots in 1944 had never landed on a carrier before entering combat. Aircraft design reflected the divergence. The Zero remained agile, but its weaknesses became lethal liabilities. It lacked armor protection for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A few hits from American machine guns often turned the aircraft into a fireball. American aircraft designers made different choices. The Grumman F-6H-6 Hellcat, introduced in 1943, was heavier and less maneuverable in tight turns, but it was faster, stronger, and brutally lethal. It carried 6.5 caliber machine guns, armor plate around the cockpit, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It could absorb damage and still bring its pilot home. Grumman engineers famously designed the Hellcat after studying a captured Zero. They did not try to outturn it. Instead, they built an aircraft that could outdive, outrun, and outgun it. American pilots were trained accordingly. They were taught never to engage Japanese fighters in turning contests. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks from altitude, firing heavy bursts, and climbing away before the enemy could respond. Speed, altitude, and firepower replaced finesse. The results were devastating. By 1944, American pilots were achieving kill ratios of 10-1 against Japanese aircraft. In some engagements, the ratio was even higher. The most decisive demonstration came in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan assembled what remained of its carrier air power, 9 carriers with over 500 aircraft. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed that if his pilots could strike first, they might still turn the tide. His plan depended on long-range attacks launched beyond American detection. But what he did not account for was American radar. U.S. carriers now possessed advanced radar systems that detected incoming aircraft far beyond visual range. Fighter directors guided interceptors precisely to their targets, vectoring squadrons into optimal attack positions. When Japanese aircraft approached Task Force 58, American fighters were already waiting. The result became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft flew into American fighter screens. Hellcats tore into formations that lacked flexibility, experience, and fuel to maneuver. Japanese pilots flew rigid attack patterns learned in abbreviated training programs. American pilots exploited every weakness. In a single day, over 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses were minimal. The next day, American aircraft struck back, sinking Japanese carriers and destroying what remained of their air groups. Japan lost 3 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and, most critically, nearly all of its remaining trained naval aviators. From that moment on, Japanese carrier aviation effectively ceased to exist. One American pilot described the battle bluntly. It wasn't combat, it was extermination. Japanese survivors told a different story, one of shock and disbelief. Pilots who had trained for months found themselves intercepted before even reaching the enemy fleet. Veterans who had survived dozens of missions in 1942 were shot down on their first sorties in 1944. American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere, guided by unseen forces. Japan had lost not only air superiority, but air viability. From this point forward, American aircraft dominated every major operation. The skies of the Pacific belonged to the United States. And now, with air power secured, American firepower would come directly to Japan itself. The capture of Saipan in July 1944 changed the war in a way Japanese leaders had never believed possible. For the first time, the Japanese home islands were within range of American bombers. Saipan was part of the Mariana Islands, territory Japan had considered an outer shield protecting the homeland. Its loss did more than remove a defensive position. It shattered a foundational assumption of Japanese strategy. Until that moment, Japanese planners believed that even if the empire lost distant islands, the home islands themselves would remain beyond the reach of sustained enemy attack. That belief died on Saipan. From airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the United States Army Air Forces could deploy the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the world. The B-29 was not merely another aircraft, it was a technological leap. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at extreme altitudes. Remote-controlled gun turrets protected the aircraft. Its range exceeded anything Japan could counter effectively. Japan had no comparable bomber. It had no effective long-range interceptor force, and it had no way to prevent what was coming. The political consequences were immediate. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the architect of Japan's war policy, resigned days after Saipan fell. The Japanese government understood what the military could not publicly admit. The war was now unwinnable. But surrender was still unthinkable. The Japanese leadership hoped, desperately, that they could inflict such severe casualties on American forces that the United States would negotiate rather than invade the home islands. This hope rested on a single assumption, that Japan could still impose intolerable costs. American industry made that impossible. Beginning in late 1944, B-29 bombers began systematic attacks on Japan. Initially, these were high-altitude precision raids targeting aircraft factories, engine plants, and steel works. But conditions over Japan made precision bombing difficult. Jet stream winds scattered bombs, cloud cover obscured targets. Results were inconsistent. In March 1945, American strategy changed. General Curtis LeMay ordered low-altitude incendiary bombing of Japanese cities. Japan's urban centers were uniquely vulnerable. Most homes were constructed of wood and paper. Firefighting infrastructure was limited. Narrow streets allowed flames to spread uncontrollably. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiaries. What followed was the deadliest air raid in human history. Firestorms swept through the city, consuming entire neighborhoods. Temperatures reached levels that melted asphalt. People suffocated as oxygen was sucked from the air. Others were trapped in canals where the water boiled. Approximately 100,000 people died in a single night. Over 1 million were left homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo were destroyed. And Tokyo was only the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers burned Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller cities. Japan's industrial system collapsed. Workers fled to the countryside. Raw materials could no longer reach factories. Aircraft production plummeted. Ammunition shortages worsened. By mid-1945, American bombers had run out of major cities to destroy. They began attacking smaller towns. Leaflets were dropped warning civilians to evacuate. Japanese authorities confiscated them, trying to preserve morale. But the people knew the truth. The air defense system had been shattered. American aircraft flew almost unopposed. Japan's response was desperation. The kamikaze campaign intensified. Suicide pilots deliberately crashed aircraft into American ships, particularly during the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Thousands of young men volunteered or were pressured to die. The kamikazes inflicted damage. Ships were sunk. Hundreds of sailors were killed. But the attacks could not stop the American advance. For every ship damaged, another arrived. For every pilot lost, dozens more took his place. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, demonstrated the full scale of American power. Over 1,300 ships supported the invasion. Nearly 180,000 Allied troops landed. Japanese defenders fought fanatically, often to the last man. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died. American deaths exceeded 12,000, with total casualties nearing 50,000. Civilian deaths may have reached another 100,000. Okinawa convinced American planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would be catastrophic. Casualty estimates ran into the millions. But another force was already in motion. Since 1942, the United States had been conducting the Manhattan Project, a secret industrial and scientific effort unlike anything the world had ever seen. Over 125,000 people worked at sites across the country. Entire cities were built in secrecy. Billions of dollars were spent. Japan had no comparable program. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion annihilated the city. Approximately 80,000 people died instantly. By the end of the year, 140,000 were dead. Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Still, elements of the Japanese military wanted to fight on. It took the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito to end the war. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time. He spoke in formal, indirect language, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan had accepted defeat. The firepower Yamamoto had warned about had reached its final form. On the morning of September 2, 1945, the war ended exactly as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had foreseen, though he did not live to see it. More than 2 years earlier, Yamamoto had been killed when American P-38 Lightning fighters, guided by intercepted Japanese communications, shot down his aircraft over Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. The architect of Pearl Harbor died knowing that his predictions were coming true, that the 6 months of victory he had promised were already giving way to defeat. Now in Tokyo Bay, the final scene unfolded. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japanese officials stood silently as General Douglas MacArthur prepared to accept Japan's formal surrender. The moment was heavy with symbolism. Surrounding the Missouri was an overwhelming display of American power, over 300 Allied warships filling the bay in precise formation. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines formed a steel cordon around the defeated empire. Above them, nearly 900 American aircraft roared overhead in carefully timed waves. It was not just a ceremony, it was a demonstration. The Japanese delegation did not need speeches to understand what they were seeing. This was the industrial might Yamamoto had warned them about decades earlier. The factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the assembly lines that never stopped. All of it had been transformed into ships, aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and logistics on a scale the world had never witnessed. As the surrender documents were signed, Japan's military leaders confronted a truth they had long known but had chosen to ignore. They had never lacked information. They had lacked the courage to accept it. After the war, American intelligence officers conducted extensive interrogations of surviving Japanese commanders under programs such as the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. What emerged from these interviews was startling in its consistency. Many Japanese leaders admitted they had understood from the beginning that war with the United States was unwinnable. They had hoped for a short conflict. They had hoped for negotiation. They had hoped America would lose interest. None of those hopes survived contact with reality. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave over Pearl Harbor and transmitted the famous Tora, Tora, Tora signal, told his interrogators that Japan's greatest mistake was not tactical, it was strategic. Pearl Harbor had failed to destroy American carriers and instead unified the American public in fury. According to Fuchida, Japan had awakened a force it could never contain. Other officers echoed the same theme. They spoke of watching American ships appear in endless numbers, each carrying more ammunition than their commands would receive in months. They described American artillery barrages so intense that entire defensive lines disappeared before infantry ever advanced. They were called naval bombardments, where American ships fired more shells in an afternoon than Japan could manufacture in weeks. Courage, they said, could not compete with machinery. The disparity extended beyond weapons. American logistics astonished them. Damaged ships returned to action in weeks. Aircraft losses were replaced almost immediately. Troops received hot meals, fresh supplies, and constant reinforcements. Japanese units, by contrast, starved, rationed ammunition, and scavenged for equipment. One Japanese general summed it up bluntly: "We were fighting a nation of machines with the strength of men alone." The final irony was that Yamamoto had tried to prevent all of this. He had warned Japan's leadership that America's strength was not its weapons, but its capacity to produce them endlessly. He had explained that capturing islands would not force surrender. He had stated plainly that only marching into Washington could secure victory, and that such a goal was impossible. His warnings were dismissed as pessimism. His prediction proved exact. Japan ran wild for 6 months. Then the giant awakened. By the time the war ended, American industry had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million military trucks, and thousands of warships. These were not propaganda figures. They were reality. In his final days, Adolf Hitler ranted about betrayal and imagined miracle weapons. Japanese militarists clung to dreams of decisive battles that never came. But the evidence was undeniable. Industrial power, combined with organizational flexibility and national mobilization, had decided the war. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He had walked through American factories. He had seen the oil fields. He had watched assembly lines operate without pause. He knew that once America committed fully to war, the outcome was inevitable. The tragedy of the Pacific War was not ignorance, it was refusal. Refusal to listen to expertise. Refusal to accept inconvenient truths. Refusal to abandon ideology when reality contradicted it. As Japanese representatives left the USS Missouri that September morning, they passed beneath aircraft wings and between steel hulls that embodied everything they had once believed impossible. Yamamoto's warning was clear, his prediction was precise, and in the end, it had been fulfilled in full. The sleeping giant had awakened, and the world paid the price.